Nora had become an expert at functioning on exhaustion. It was a skill she had never wanted, but one she had perfected nonetheless. Between the long hours at St. Mary's Hospital, the night shifts that left her in a constant state of grogginess, and the ever-present pressure of being the only one Maddie depended on, there was never enough time. Not for sleep, not for worry, and certainly not for unexpected problems. Which was why, when Patrick knocked on her door that afternoon, she didn't think much of it at first. She wiped her hands on the sweatpants she'd been wearing for 2 days straight and opened the door, already anticipating the usual condescending remarks about the state of the hallway or Maddie's toys being left out. Instead, he handed her a stack of papers with the casual air of a man passing out takeout menus. "Need you out in 2 weeks," he said. For a moment, she just stared at the words printed in bold at the top of the first page, "Notice of Eviction." The legal jargon blurred together as her brain worked to process it. What? Patrick sighed like she was being difficult on purpose. "I'm selling the building." Nora blinked at him, still holding the papers but not quite gripping them yet. "You can't just." "It's all in there," he interrupted, tapping the top page. "I've given you the required notice, and you'll get your deposit back once you're out." Deposit. The word was almost laughable. She had moved in so long ago under her mother's lease that whatever deposit had existed had probably been absorbed into the universe. "Patrick, I have a kid. I need time. That's why I'm giving you 2 weeks instead of 1, he said, as though he expected gratitude. Then he was gone, his heavy steps echoing down the hall, leaving Nora standing in the doorway holding the worst news she had received in years. Maddie, unaware of the disaster that had just landed in their lives, was busy on the floor arranging her stuffed animals into a perfect line. "Mommy, Teddy, and Bella are getting married today." Nora forced herself to smile. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." She closed the door and leaned against it, papers still in hand, the weight of reality settling in. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to find a new home when she could barely afford the rent they had now. She spent the next few days in a haze of stress and denial, making phone calls to apartment listings that were either already taken or laughably out of her budget. The city was impossible. Rents had skyrocketed, and landlords weren't exactly eager to rent to a single mother with an inconsistent schedule and a paycheck that barely covered the essentials. When she wasn't making fruitless phone calls, she was at work, trying not to let the panic show on her face as she moved from one patient to the next. The exhaustion had always been there, but now it came with an extra layer of dread. Eventually, she realized she needed to start packing, if only to give herself the illusion of control. The apartment was small, and yet there were years of accumulated memories stacked on every shelf, tucked into every drawer. She packed Maddie's things first, tucking them into boxes as gently as if they were living things. Her own things were easier: clothes, books, and a handful of sentimental items. But then she came to her mother's things. Even after all these years, she hadn't been able to bring herself to go through them. They sat neatly stored in the same cardboard boxes she had packed them in after the funeral, sealed with aging tape. They had been too painful to look at, yet too important to throw away. She hesitated for a long time before finally sitting on the floor and peeling back the tape. Inside was a mix of photographs, old letters, and the paperwork of a life lived in quiet resilience. Her mother's medical records, insurance documents, employment stubs from the diner she had worked at for nearly 2 decades. There were birthday cards, some from Nora to her mother, others from her mother to Nora, filled with looping cursive and words she could barely read through the tightness in her chest. And then, buried beneath it all, something strange. A manila envelope, aged and yellowing, addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. She pulled it out, confused, and felt a stack of legal papers inside. She unfolded them, expecting something insignificant. Instead, she found a property deed. Her name was printed clearly in the ownership section, though the date was from over 20 years ago. Her mother had signed it as the legal guardian at the time. It made no sense. She flipped through the pages, scanning for an explanation, but the language was dense with legal terms she didn't understand. A house. Not just any house, an estate. An address she didn't recognize in a part of the city she had never stepped foot in. Nora stared at it, unblinking, her brain struggling to piece together a puzzle she hadn't even known existed. She reached for her phone and typed the address into a search engine. Within seconds, images filled her screen. A sprawling, historic mansion. A grand entrance framed by towering oak trees. Windows stretching 2 stories high, light spilling from them in a way that made the place look more like a castle than a house. It was impossible. She checked the name again, but it was right there in black ink. She, Nora Dawson, was the legal owner of an estate that looked like something out of an architectural magazine. She set the paper down on her lap, feeling suddenly very, very small in the middle of her cramped apartment, surrounded by boxes that contained the sum of her life. Had her mother known? Had she kept this from her? Or had this, like everything else, been buried by time and circumstance, lost in the chaos of hospital visits and unpaid bills? Nora exhaled, trying to steady herself. It didn't matter how it had happened. It only mattered that it was real. And if it was real, she needed to find out why. The county records office was the kind of place where time felt like it had stopped moving sometime in the early 90s. The walls were lined with metal filing cabinets, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and a coffee machine in the corner let out a low gurgle, filling the room with the smell of burnt beans. The space was quiet except for the rhythmic clacking of a keyboard and the occasional shuffle of paper. Nora hesitated just inside the entrance, gripping the envelope containing the deed like it might dissolve in her hands. She wasn't supposed to be here. None of this made sense. She had spent her entire life piecing things together one shift at a time, stretching every dollar as far as it would go, planning for emergencies she couldn't afford. Owning a mansion, an estate, wasn't just unlikely. It was ridiculous. Still, the words on the deed hadn't changed overnight. Her name was there in bold, legal print. The address of a house she had never seen was listed below. The more she tried to explain it away, the more impossible it became. She walked up to the counter, where a middle-aged woman with short, efficiently styled hair and glasses hanging from a delicate gold chain peered at her over the rim of a steaming mug. Her expression said she had seen everything and was unimpressed by all of it. "Help you with something?" Nora cleared her throat, placing the envelope on the counter. "I need to verify a property record." The woman let out a soft sigh and put her mug down before pulling the papers toward her. She flipped through them with the precision of someone who had been doing this for too long and had no patience for nonsense. "What address?" Nora read it off slowly, like she might mispronounce it and wake up from whatever strange dream she had fallen into. The woman typed into her computer, barely glancing at the monitor as her fingers moved over the keyboard. She paused, tapped a few more keys, then tilted her head slightly. "Huh," she muttered. "Haven't had anyone ask about this place in years." Nora shifted her weight from foot to foot. "So it's real?" The woman nodded. "Real as it gets. Still listed under the same owner." Nora forced a steady breath. "And that is?" The woman slid the documents back toward her, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail on the name at the top. "Nora Dawson." The room tilted slightly. The floor didn't move, but it felt like it had. "That," she shook her head, letting out a sharp, breathy laugh. "That can't be right." The woman's expression remained flat. "You're telling me you don't know you own a house?" "Not just a house," Nora said, gripping the edge of the counter. "A mansion." "Well," the woman said, returning her attention to the screen, "congratulations, I guess." Nora exhaled through her nose. "Why wouldn't I know about this?" The woman typed again. "Looks like the property was transferred into a holding trust when you were a child. Standard practice when a minor inherits real estate." The trust would have been set to release the title to you when you turned 25. Nora stared at her. I'm 28. The woman raised an eyebrow. Then you should have gotten notice 3 years ago. Nora let out another short, humorless laugh. I didn't. The woman sighed and adjusted her glasses. Well, there's nothing in here about a hold on the transfer. The ownership was just waiting to be claimed. Nora pressed a hand to her forehead. So if I wanted to see it? You'd have every right, the woman said. You can walk in there right now and demand the keys. Nora could barely believe the words. She had spent years counting pennies, working double shifts, living in an apartment where she could hear her neighbors sneeze through the walls, and yet all this time, she had owned a house. Not just any house, a mansion in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. The woman tapped another key and squinted at the screen. Looks like the transfer was arranged by a Vincent Hayes. Nora's pulse quickened. Who? The woman shrugged. No further details here. You'd have to pull older records, probably archived at the main courthouse. Nora turned the name over in her head. It didn't sound familiar. It wasn't a distant relative she had forgotten or a family friend she had heard stories about. It was a complete mystery. She thanked the clerk and walked out of the office into the warm afternoon air, feeling like she had stepped into an entirely different reality. The city streets carried on as usual, cars honked in the distance, people rushed by with coffee cups and briefcases, a group of teenagers laughed loudly as they crossed the street, but Nora stood frozen, gripping the envelope tightly against her chest. This was real. The deed was real. And if it was real, then that meant her mother had known about it. That thought sent a fresh wave of confusion through her. Why hadn't she been told? She turned the possibilities over in her mind as she walked to her car, the envelope tucked under her arm like it might disappear if she let go of it. Maybe her mother had meant to tell her but never got the chance. The illness had come suddenly, changing everything overnight. Nora had spent so much time juggling hospital visits and bills that there had been no room for anything else. Her mother had been fading, and Nora had been too busy trying to hold everything together to notice anything else. Or maybe she had known and had chosen not to tell her. Maybe there had been a reason. She sat in her car, staring at the envelope in her lap, the name Vincent Hayes repeating in her mind. Who was he? Why had he left her an entire estate? And why had she never known until now? The street noise faded as she stared out the windshield, lost in thought. She had spent her whole life struggling, always trying to make the best out of nothing, stretching herself thin for every paycheck. Had she really been sitting on a fortune this whole time? The thought made her dizzy. A strange feeling settled in her stomach, something between disbelief and something she wasn't ready to name yet. Something had been kept from her. Whether it was by accident, by neglect, or by design, she didn't know yet. But she was going to find out. Nora sat across from the lawyer, gripping the edge of his polished desk like it might steady the surreal reality she was about to be pulled into. The office smelled of leather and ink, the kind of place where people signed papers that changed their lives. She wasn't sure if her life was about to change for the better or if she was walking into yet another disappointment, but at this point, she was too far in to back out. The lawyer, a meticulous man named Alan Whitmore, adjusted his glasses and flipped through the paperwork she had brought. His desk was unnervingly neat, not a single stray paperclip or coffee ring in sight. He skimmed the deed, nodded to himself, and then leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced in front of him. Well, he said, pausing just long enough to make her want to shake the words out of him, this is certainly unusual. Nora exhaled sharply. I'm getting used to that. Whitmore tapped the edge of the papers. Legally, this estate is yours. The deed is clear. It was placed in a holding trust until you turned 25, and since you're 28, you've had legal ownership for 3 years. She had heard this part before. It still didn't make sense. Then why didn't I know about it? That, he said, is the real question. Nora waited as he pulled out a file from a drawer and started scanning through the system on his computer. He muttered something under his breath, shaking his head before finally looking up. "There was no legal reason to withhold this information from you," he said. "The estate should have been transferred automatically, or at the very least, you should have been notified." Nora clenched her jaw. That wasn't what she wanted to hear. She wanted to hear that it was all a mistake, that it had been tied up in paperwork and simply misplaced. Not that someone had chosen to keep it from her. She folded her arms. "So I just walk up and move in?" Whitmore hesitated. "Not exactly." Nora's stomach dropped. "There's a complication," he said, adjusting his tie. "The estate is currently occupied." She blinked at him. "By who?" Whitmore sighed. "Jameson Hayes." The name didn't mean anything to her, but the way he said it made her stomach tighten. "And he's, what, renting it?" Whitmore shook his head. "He's lived there for years. Which means, even though you are the legal owner, he may have a claim through adverse possession." She frowned. Adverse possession? If someone occupies a property for long enough, under certain conditions, they can establish legal ownership, he explained. He may argue that, despite the deed being in your name, the estate has been his rightful home. Nora's hands curled into fists. "That's ridiculous. It's not an easy claim to make, and it doesn't change the fact that the deed is in your name." "But someone like Jameson Hayes," he paused, as if debating how much to say, then sighed. "He has money. He has lawyers. He'll make this difficult for you." Nora leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Of course, this wouldn't be simple. Of course, someone powerful was standing between her and something that was rightfully hers. "What do I do?" she asked finally. "You'll need to present your ownership," Whitmore said. "You have every legal right to step foot on that property and make your claim. But I'd recommend being prepared for a fight." Nora squared her shoulders. "I can handle that." He smiled wryly. "I hope so." The next day, she stood outside the estate's towering iron gates, gripping the paperwork tightly. It was massive. More than just a house, it was something out of a history book, the kind of place where politicians held secret meetings and old money families sipped whiskey in grand libraries. The driveway stretched so far that she couldn't even see the house clearly from where she stood. It was a different world, one that looked as far from her tiny apartment as another planet. A security booth sat to the side of the entrance, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out the moment she approached. He didn't ask what she was doing there. He already knew. "Miss Dawson," he said, glancing at her paperwork before she could even speak. Her grip on the papers tightened. "Yes." The man barely reacted. "You are not permitted inside." Nora blinked. "Excuse me?" The security guard was unfazed. "Mr. Hayes does not have time for drop-in visits." Her stomach burned. "This isn't a visit. This is my property." She held up the deed. "You see this? This says I own this house. So unless you have another piece of paper that says otherwise, I'd like to go inside now." The man didn't even glance at the document. "I'll let Mr. Hayes know you were here." Nora clenched her jaw. "You do that." She turned sharply on her heel, marching back to her car. The rejection wasn't surprising, but it still made her blood simmer. An hour later, she sat across from Jameson Hayes himself. His office wasn't in the mansion, it was in a skyscraper, one of those sleek, soulless towers with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that reminded you exactly who had the power. He was waiting when she arrived, seated behind a desk that looked large enough to land a plane on. She had expected someone older, but Jameson was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with sharp features, dark hair, and the kind of confidence that came from knowing you could crush whoever sat across from you. He barely glanced at the paperwork she placed on his desk. I assume you're here about the house, he said smoothly, as if they were discussing dry cleaning. Nora folded her arms. The house I own? Yes. Jameson leaned back in his chair. That's debatable. She narrowed her eyes. Is it? Because the county records office seemed pretty sure. He exhaled through his nose, a ghost of amusement crossing his face. That document is an interesting artifact, but it holds no real legal weight. Nora's patience snapped. This isn't a museum piece. This is a legal deed. With my name on it. Jameson tilted his head. And yet, I live there. Have for years. She leaned forward. Right. And you knew it wasn't yours, didn't you? For the first time, something flickered in his expression. A hesitation so brief she might have imagined it. But she hadn't. You can bring whatever paperwork you like, he said smoothly. That estate has been my home, and I have the means to keep it that way. Nora let the words settle between them. There it was. The truth beneath the carefully measured words. He wasn't just dismissing her, he was daring her. She picked up the paperwork and stood. We'll see about that. Jameson gave her a polite, meaningless smile. I suppose we will. Nora had always assumed research was something done by people with patience. Scholars, journalists, people who had time to spend afternoons combing through archives. She was not one of those people. But here she was, sitting in the hushed corner of the city library, surrounded by stacks of newspaper clippings and historical records, trying to untangle the mystery of how she had come to own a mansion she had never even heard of. The name Vincent Hayes kept surfacing in every article, every mention of the estate. He had been a fixture in the city decades ago, the kind of man whose name was on scholarships, charity boards, and old plaques bolted to hospital walls. According to the newspaper clippings spread in front of her, Vincent Hayes had been a well-respected philanthropist, a businessman who had poured his fortune into programs for struggling families. He had donated millions to housing initiatives, medical care, education funds, causes that, ironically, would have changed Nora's entire life had she known about them. She frowned, scanning the article in front of her. A black and white photo of Vincent accompanied the piece, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. He had the look of someone used to being listened to, a presence that demanded attention without effort. The words beneath the image described him as a man of principles, a believer in second chances. It didn't line up with the grandson she had met. Jameson Hayes had made it clear he had no intention of acknowledging that the mansion wasn't his, let alone recognizing that it had been legally left to her. And yet, everything about his grandfather suggested he was a man who would have never allowed what had happened to Nora's mother. If Vincent had been alive today, would things have been different? The question sat heavily in her mind as she turned the next page of the archive. You look like you're planning a heist, a voice said, cutting through the quiet. Nora looked up to see a woman standing at the end of the table, watching her with an amused expression. She had the kind of face that made you immediately trust her, sharp but kind, the sort of person who probably remembered every book she'd ever read. I'm actually trying to solve one, Nora muttered, pushing a stack of clippings aside. The woman smiled. Well, you're certainly in the right place for that. She extended a hand. Margaret Lawson. Head librarian, unofficial keeper of forgotten things. Nora shook her hand, feeling a little ridiculous. Nora Dawson. Owner of a house I've never stepped foot in. Margaret arched an eyebrow. That's an interesting introduction. It's an interesting situation. Nora tapped the article in front of her. I'm trying to find out more about Vincent Hayes. Margaret's expression softened, and she pulled out the chair across from her, sitting like she was settling in for a story. Vincent was an unusual man for his time. Born into money, but never acted like it. He used to say that wealth was a tool, not a reward. Nora leaned forward. Did you know him? Margaret nodded. I was a child when he passed, but my parents worked with him. My mother ran one of the outreach programs he funded. He helped a lot of people. Nora hesitated before asking the next question. Do you think my mother could have been one of them? Margaret studied her for a moment, then reached for one of the clippings. Maybe. What was her name? Elizabeth Dawson. Margaret nodded and stood, motioning for Nora to follow. Come with me. They walked past shelves of books and old microfilm readers until they reached a row of cabinets labeled with worn stickers, historical archives, housing assistance, 1980s to 1990s. Margaret opened one of the drawers and started flipping through folders. Vincent kept meticulous records of the families he helped. If your mother was one of them, there may be something here. Nora held her breath as Margaret scanned the files, her fingers trailing over names, flipping past lists and reports. Then, she stopped. She pulled out a worn file and set it on the table. Elizabeth Dawson, she read aloud. Nora's pulse kicked up. Margaret carefully opened the folder, revealing pages of documents, old forms stamped with Vincent Hayes' name. There were records of financial aid, housing assistance, even personal notes. Nora picked up one of the pages, scanning the faded ink. Her mother had been in contact with Vincent Hayes directly. There were letters where he had written personally, asking if she had everything she needed, offering continued support. One letter, dated just a few months before his passing, caught her eye. Elizabeth. You have my word that I will make this right. I want your child to have what is hers. No one can take that from her. Nora's hands trembled as she held the page. Vincent had known. He had fought for her. And then, somehow, after his death, everything had been buried. The library smelled like paper and dust, the kind of comforting mustiness that made Nora feel like she had stepped back in time. She had spent hours at the wooden table, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and yellow documents, but it was the photograph that stopped her cold. She hadn't even been looking for it. Margaret, the librarian, had pulled a box of archived materials labeled Hayes Estate, 1980s to 1990s, and set it on the table with a quiet, maybe there's something useful in here. Nora had been sifting through papers with the kind of focus that made her head throb when her fingers brushed over the glossy edge of a photograph wedged between old ledger sheets. She lifted it carefully, her breath catching as she took in the image. A woman stood in front of the mansion. Young, beautiful, caught mid-laugh, with one hand on her hip and the other resting against the curve of her belly. Her mother. Nora traced the outline of her face with her thumb, the familiar features making something tighten in her chest. It wasn't just that Elizabeth Dawson was standing in front of the estate. It was the way she looked, comfortable, at home. Like she belonged there. She turned the photograph over, her pulse skipping at the neat handwriting scrawled across the back. Elizabeth, summer of '92. The date made Nora's skin prickle. Summer of '92. The year she was born. Her mother had been pregnant, standing in front of the estate, the house that was now legally Nora's. She stared at the photo for a long time before finally looking up at Margaret. My mother lived here. The words felt strange leaving her mouth. Margaret frowned, leaning over to glance at the photograph. She worked there, I'd guess. That dress looks like a uniform. Nora felt like the air had thickened around her. She never mentioned working for the Hayes family. Margaret tapped a finger thoughtfully against the table. Maybe she didn't want to. That thought settled uncomfortably in Nora's stomach. Margaret reached for another folder from the archive box, flipping through pages with careful precision. If she worked there, there might be payroll records. Employment files. Something. Nora watched her turn page after page, tension creeping up her spine. And then Margaret let out a quiet, aha, and slid a sheet of paper in front of her. Employee roster, Hayes Estate, 1992. Nora's eyes scanned the names, her heart hammering as she found it. Elizabeth Dawson, server. It was real. Her mother had worked at the mansion. She felt like the world had just tilted slightly to the left. Margaret pursed her lips. If she was working there while pregnant, maybe someone from that time still remembers her. Nora swallowed hard. How would I even find them? Margaret tapped a finger against the paper. There's a name here you might want to look into. House manager, Catherine Miller. She would have been overseeing the staff. Nora grabbed her phone and started searching. The name brought up a few results, mostly outdated contact pages, until finally, she found an address. It wasn't far. Margaret gave her an encouraging nod. If anyone knows what really happened, it's her. Nora barely remembered driving across town. She knocked on the door of a modest little house with a neat front garden, gripping the photograph in her free hand like it might disappear if she let go. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, her expression sharp with curiosity. Yes? Nora hesitated. Are you Catherine Miller? The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. Who's asking? Nora exhaled. My name is Nora Dawson. My mother was Elizabeth Dawson. Catherine blinked, the sharpness in her gaze softening just slightly. Elizabeth's girl, she murmured. Nora nodded. Catherine studied her for a long moment before sighing and stepping back. You better come in. The house smelled like vanilla and lemon polish, the kind of warm, lived-in scent that made Nora's shoulders relax just slightly. Catherine motioned for her to sit at the small kitchen table, then filled 2 cups of tea before settling across from her. You have your mother's eyes, she said finally. Nora swallowed. You knew her? Catherine nodded. I was the house manager when she worked at the estate. Nora laid the photograph on the table between them. Catherine's expression flickered as she picked it up, her fingers tracing the edges. She was happy here, Catherine said softly. Then her lips pressed into a thin line. At least at first. Nora's heart pounded. At first? Catherine sighed. I don't know how much you already know, but your mother, she got involved with someone she shouldn't have. Nora's hands clenched in her lap. Who? Catherine's expression was careful. Vincent Hayes had 2 sons. And your mother, well, she was involved with one of them. Nora's mouth felt dry. She had come here searching for a connection, for a reason why her name was on the deed. She hadn't expected this. Catherine watched her, gauging her reaction before continuing. She was young. He was charming. At least, in the beginning. But when she got pregnant, things changed. Nora's stomach turned. He didn't want to take responsibility, did he? Catherine let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Not even close. Nora exhaled shakily. What happened? Catherine hesitated, then set the photograph down. Vincent wanted his son to do the right thing. He told him to own up, to take care of her and the baby. Nora's jaw tightened. And? Catherine's eyes darkened. He refused. He was angry. Said it wasn't his problem. He even tried to pay her off to keep quiet about it. Nora felt something hot and furious curl in her chest. But Vincent didn't let that happen, Catherine added. He stepped in. Told your mother she didn't have to take a cent from him. That she wasn't going to be discarded like that. Nora gritted her teeth. And that's when he put the house in my name. Catherine nodded. He wanted you to have something. He said if his son wouldn't do right by you, then he would. Nora's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just about a house. This was about a man who had tried to erase her existence. And another man who had fought to make sure he didn't. Catherine reached across the table, squeezing Nora's hand gently. Your mother was strong. She didn't let them break her. And neither should you. Nora gripped her fingers tightly around the photograph. She wasn't going to. Nora sat in her car outside Catherine's house, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. The weight of everything she had just learned pressed down on her chest. Her mother had been cast aside, ignored, and left to struggle alone, not because there was no help, but because it had been stolen from her. Vincent Hayes had tried to do right by her mother, had tried to make sure she had something, that Nora had something. But he had died before he could ensure it. And when he was gone, the people left in charge had erased his decision. Jameson's father had taken control, sweeping away any trace of Vincent's wishes. He had never asked questions, never wondered what had happened to Elizabeth Dawson and the baby his father had fought to protect. He had let his brother's indifference stand. And because of that, Nora and her mother had spent their lives struggling. Nora had grown up thinking her mother's hardships were just bad luck, a cruel hand dealt by life. But that wasn't true. Someone had made that choice for them. And Jameson Hayes had inherited it. She took a shaky breath and stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Was it possible he didn't know? Jameson had been a child when all of this happened. He hadn't been the one to cast her mother aside. He hadn't been the one to ignore Vincent's wishes. Maybe he had simply been raised in the house, never questioning why it was his, never knowing what had been erased before he was old enough to understand it. Maybe he wasn't the villain she thought. She didn't know why that idea unsettled her so much. She had hated him so easily before, convinced he was another cold, ruthless billionaire who would do anything to keep what wasn't his. But if he was just as much a byproduct of his family's choices as she was, then what? There was only one way to find out. She walked into his office without an appointment. The receptionist barely had time to protest before Nora strode through the glass doors, her heart pounding against her ribs. Jameson looked up from his desk, clearly caught off guard. For the first time, he didn't have that effortless control, that quiet smugness that made her want to throw something at him. "Miss Dawson," he said slowly, setting down his pen. "You certainly don't waste time." Nora placed both hands on his desk and met his gaze head-on. "I know the truth." He studied her, his face unreadable. "You'll have to be more specific." She forced herself to stay calm. "I know what happened to my mother. I know your grandfather tried to help her. I know my name was on that house because he put it there, because he wanted me to have it." Jameson leaned back in his chair, eyes flicking over her face, searching for something. And I need to know if you knew," she said. "Did you know what your father and uncle did? That they ignored your grandfather's wishes? That my mother was left with nothing while you were raised in a house that was never meant to be yours?" Jameson was silent for a moment. Then he stood, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "That house has been in my family for decades," he said. "Do you really think one conversation changes that?" Something about his tone made her stomach drop. He hadn't denied it. Her throat tightened. "You knew." Jameson exhaled, shaking his head like she was exhausting him. "You don't belong in this world, Miss Dawson. You think because you found a few old papers that suddenly you can rewrite history?" She gritted her teeth. "This isn't history. This is theft." His expression darkened. "Be careful what you accuse me of." Nora refused to back down. "You don't get to threaten me." Jameson leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "Actually," he said, voice low and even, "I do." She stared at him, waiting. "If you continue to pursue this," he said smoothly, "I will bury you in legal battles for years. You have no money. No connections. You may have a deed, but I have an army of lawyers who will ensure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." Nora's breath caught. He wasn't dismissing her anymore. He was warning her. She had come here thinking maybe he hadn't known, maybe he would be horrified to learn what his family had done. But he wasn't horrified. He was telling her, in no uncertain terms, that he would destroy her if she kept pushing. She forced herself to stand tall, even as her hands shook. "I'm not scared of you," she said. Jameson smiled, slow and deliberate. That's your mistake. She turned and walked out, willing herself not to show how rattled she was. As soon as she was outside, she pulled out her phone and called Alan Whitmore. The lawyer answered on the third ring. Miss Dawson? I need you to look into something for me, she said, swallowing past the lump in her throat. Jameson Hayes just told me his grandfather's will was nullified because he was declared mentally unfit before his death. Alan went silent for a moment. Then, in a careful voice, he asked, and you want me to confirm if that's true? Nora exhaled sharply. I want to know who did it. There was a pause. Understood, he said. Nora paced the sidewalk outside the office, arms wrapped around herself as she tried to stop her hands from shaking. She wasn't afraid of Jameson. Not exactly. But she had seen something in his expression just now, something that told her he wasn't bluffing. Half an hour later, Alan called her back. His voice was tight. You're not going to like this. Nora closed her eyes. Tell me. He hesitated, then said, Jameson Hayes was the one who orchestrated the process to nullify the will. The world tilted. She gripped the phone tighter. You're sure? His father was still alive at the time, but he was ill, Alan explained. Jameson handled the legal filings himself. He pushed for the incompetency ruling. He made sure the will never saw the light of day. Nora felt sick. Jameson had always known. From the moment she walked into his office, from the second she mentioned the estate, he had known exactly who she was. He hadn't been surprised. He hadn't needed time to process it. Because he had already made the decision, years ago, to ensure she never got what was hers. She had given him the benefit of the doubt. And he had stolen her inheritance before she had even known it existed. Her mother had spent her life scraping by, and Jameson had grown up in luxury, knowing exactly what had been taken from them. She gritted her teeth. She had wanted to believe he wasn't a villain. But she had been very, very wrong. The weight of everything was pressing against Nora's chest so hard she felt like she might shatter under it. The city was still alive around her, people laughing in the distance, car horns blaring, neon signs flickering in storefront windows, but she was frozen, gripping the steering wheel of her car, her hands so tight that the skin stretched white over her knuckles. Maddie stirred in the back seat, shifting under the thin blanket Nora had draped over her. Her little face was soft in sleep, her breath steady, the rise and fall of her small chest the only thing keeping Nora anchored to this moment. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. She had left the lawyer's office with nothing but rage in her veins, the truth sinking deeper into her bones with every step. The family that should have been hers had erased her, cast her mother aside, rewritten history so cleanly that she had grown up believing she was just unlucky. That she had never belonged anywhere. That her mother's struggles had been normal, just the way things were. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that they had let her mother suffer, allowed her to raise Nora in the kind of poverty that could have been avoided if Vincent Hayes' wishes had been honored. If his son had been any kind of man. Jameson had known. All along, he had known. And instead of admitting it, instead of even pretending to care, he had threatened her, dared her to challenge him, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. She swallowed the lump in her throat and looked down at the eviction notice crumpled in the passenger seat. No home. No money. And now, a legal battle she had no idea how to fight. She had tried to be strong in front of Jameson, but the second she had walked out of his office, reality had crashed down on her. Her apartment was gone. She had spent the last of her savings paying off overdue bills, hoping she could at least buy herself some time. There was no safety net, no backup plan. She had packed everything she could fit into the car, and when night fell, she had driven around aimlessly, trying to figure out what to do next. She couldn't tell Maddie. Her daughter had asked why they weren't going home, and Nora had forced a smile, telling her they were going on a little adventure, that it would be fun, that they'd find somewhere nice to stay soon. And Maddie, trusting and sleepy, had nodded and curled up in the back seat. Nora hadn't known where to go. She had considered calling Catherine, but she barely knew the woman, and the thought of showing up on her doorstep, desperate and lost, made her stomach twist. She had looked up cheap motels, but even those were too much right now. So she had pulled into a quiet lot on the outskirts of town, just for a little while. Just to figure things out. But now it was nearly midnight, and she was still here. Her body ached from exhaustion, but sleep wasn't an option. The car was cold, the windows fogging slightly from the warmth of their breath. Her neck was stiff, her back sore from hours of sitting in the same position. She rubbed her hands over her face, inhaling deeply to keep herself steady. Her mother had been in this position. Maybe not exactly like this, but close enough. Nora had memories of coming home from school to find another eviction notice on the door, of watching her mother smile tightly and tell her not to worry, even when her eyes were red from crying. She had spent her whole life promising herself she would never let Maddie go through that. And yet, here they were. She turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting to the mansion in the distance. It wasn't visible from here, but she knew it was there, sitting on that sprawling estate behind its locked gates, full of expensive furniture and empty hallways. Her house. It was supposed to be hers. She clenched her teeth, her nails digging into the steering wheel. If she had known, if she had grown up with what was rightfully hers, Maddie wouldn't be asleep in the back seat of a car right now. She would have had a home. She would have had a backyard, a bedroom filled with toys, a life without Nora constantly counting every dollar, stretching every meal, panicking every time the rent was due. Instead, they had given her nothing. And Jameson had sat in that office, in his stolen home, and told her that she was the one who didn't belong. The thought made her blood burn. She had been pushed down, dismissed, ignored. But she wasn't going to let them win. She turned in her seat, reaching back to gently tuck Maddie's blanket around her shoulders. Then she faced forward again, staring into the dark. This wasn't over. Not even close. Nora sat in Alan Whitmore's office, her fingers tightening around the armrest of the chair as he flipped through a thick stack of legal documents. The steady ticking of a clock on the wall filled the silence, each second stretching painfully as she waited for him to say something. The polished wood of his desk reflected the dim glow of the office lamp, and for a moment, she focused on the details, the scuff on the edge of the desk, the faint smell of old paper and coffee lingering in the air, anything to keep herself from drowning in the anxiety crawling up her spine. Alan set the stack down with a sigh and removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. He was always calm, always composed, but there was a sharp edge to his voice when he finally spoke. It's going to be brutal. Nora exhaled. I figured. They aren't just going to fight you on this, he said, tapping the papers. They're going to bury you in it. They know you don't have the resources for a long legal battle, so they're throwing everything at you. They want you to give up before this even gets to court. Nora leaned forward. That's not happening. Alan studied her, his expression unreadable. You're sure? She didn't hesitate. Absolutely. A small nod of approval. Then let's go over what we're up against. He slid the top document toward her, and she forced herself to focus on the words. Response to claim of inheritance, the estate of Vincent Hayes. Her stomach twisted. They're arguing that you have no legal right to inherit the property, Alan said, flipping through the pages. And they're using every possible angle to make that argument. She swallowed hard. Like what? Alan scanned the document, then gave her a hard look. First, they're claiming you were born out of wedlock and therefore have no standing to inherit anything from the Hayes family. Nora let out a sharp laugh, though there was nothing funny about it. So now I'm illegitimate? In their eyes, yes. She gritted her teeth. Vincent put my name on the deed. That should be enough. It should be. Alan sighed. But they're arguing that because your mother wasn't married to Vincent's son, You were never legally considered part of the family. Nora's fingers curled into fists. Jameson is the grandson of a man who wanted me to have the house, but somehow, I'm the one who doesn't belong? Alan gave her a knowing look. They aren't relying on fairness. They're relying on technicalities. Nora clenched her jaw. What else? Alan slid another page toward her. They're also arguing that your mother never took legal action after Vincent's death, which means she forfeited any claim you might have had. Her stomach twisted. She didn't even know she had a claim. They're saying ignorance isn't a defense. That if she had a legitimate right to the inheritance, she would have pursued it. Nora's grip on the chair tightened. They erased her. They buried the paperwork. And now they're blaming her for not fighting back. Alan nodded. That's their strategy. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Her mother had worked herself to the bone to provide for her. Had gone without, struggled, scraped by, never knowing that there had been something set aside for her, something that could have changed everything. And now, even in death, they were trying to erase her all over again. Nora lowered her gaze. What do we do? Alan's voice was steady. We prove that she never knew. That the family intentionally kept her from learning the truth. Nora's fingers curled into the edge of her seat. That, she could do. That, she would fight for. The formal response from the Hayes family's legal team arrived less than a week later, and it was everything Alan had warned her about. Nora sat at her kitchen table, or what was left of it, reading through the thick stack of papers while Maddie colored quietly on the floor. The apartment was already half-packed, boxes stacked against the walls, the reality of her impending eviction looming over her like a dark cloud. She forced herself to focus on the document in her hands, her pulse quickening as she scanned the lines. The plaintiff, Nora Dawson, has no legal claim to the Hayes estate. She swallowed hard and kept reading. As an illegitimate child, she was never recognized as a member of the Hayes family. Her throat tightened. Furthermore, Elizabeth Dawson's failure to make a legal claim prior to her passing constitutes a forfeiture of any rights the plaintiff may attempt to assert. Nora set the papers down, pressing her palms against the table. They were making it sound like her mother had chosen to walk away from what was rightfully hers. That she had willfully ignored an inheritance that could have changed her life. But the truth was she had never been given a choice. Her mother had been lied to. Kept in the dark. Pushed aside. And now, Jameson and his lawyers were trying to cement that lie into legal fact. Her phone buzzed beside her, and she grabbed it, pressing it to her ear without looking. Alan's voice was sharp. I just read their filing. Nora exhaled. They're trying to make it seem like my mother never cared about any of this. They're trying to erase her, Alan corrected. And if we don't fight this properly, they'll erase you too. Nora gritted her teeth. What do we do? We build a case proving that she was never given the chance to claim what was hers, Alan said. We show that Jameson's father and uncle intentionally concealed Vincent's wishes. Nora took a shaky breath. How? We need documents, records, anything that proves Vincent intended for you to inherit the estate. Alan hesitated. And we need to get ahead of them. Because they aren't going to stop with just legal arguments. Nora frowned. What do you mean? They're going to dig into your life, Nora. They're going to look for anything they can use against you. Financial struggles, job history, maybe even personal details that have nothing to do with this case. Nora's chest tightened. They'll go after Maddie, won't they? Alan's voice softened. They'll use anything they can. Nora pressed her fingers against her temple. She had expected resistance. She had expected a fight. But she hadn't expected them to go this far. She looked at Maddie, still coloring on the floor, completely unaware of what was happening around her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her daughter. For her mother. For every lie that had been told to keep them from what was theirs. Nora took a deep breath. I don't care what they throw at me, she said. We're going to win. Alan didn't hesitate. Then let's get to work. The meeting was supposed to be private. A closed-door, damage control discussion among the people who had spent decades pretending Nora Dawson didn't exist. But nothing stayed hidden forever, especially not in a family like the Hayes. The moment the lawsuit became public record, whispers spread through the ranks of the wealthy and well-connected. Lawyers exchanged guarded glances, investors asked quiet questions, and inside the Hayes estate itself, a fracture began to form. The first person to panic was Jonathan Hayes, Vincent's eldest son and Jameson's uncle. He had been involved in family affairs his entire life, carefully maintaining the image of a dynasty built on power and wealth. The idea that some unknown woman, some illegitimate child, could come in and unravel everything they had spent decades securing made his stomach turn. He paced the length of the study, his movements sharp, agitated. This is a disaster. Jameson sat in one of the leather armchairs, unreadable as always, but his fingers were tense against the armrest. Across from him, his mother, Eleanor Hayes, adjusted the pearl necklace around her throat with the kind of slow, calculated grace that had been perfected over years of high society negotiations. Jonathan turned to her. How did this happen? Eleanor's expression didn't change. You tell me, Jonathan. Weren't you the one who assured us that this would never come up again? His jaw tightened. Because it wasn't supposed to. She has a legal claim, Jameson said, his voice even. And we all know it. Jonathan's face darkened. That doesn't mean she should win. Eleanor exhaled, smoothing a hand over her silk sleeve. It wouldn't have gone this far if you had taken care of it properly all those years ago. Jonathan turned on her. And what would you have had me do, Eleanor? Kill the woman? The child? There was a sharp silence. Jameson's fingers tapped against the armrest. Let's not be dramatic. Jonathan let out a sharp breath and turned away, running a hand through his graying hair. We should have buried this deeper. Made sure there were no records left. Eleanor studied him. You mean we should have erased her completely? That's exactly what we did, Jonathan snapped. And it worked, for 28 years. Eleanor's lips pressed together. She had known about Elizabeth Dawson, of course. Knew that her late husband and his brother had made sure Vincent's will never saw the light of day. But she had assumed that was the end of it. Jameson finally leaned forward, his voice cool and detached. We have two options. Fight or negotiate. Jonathan scoffed. There's nothing to negotiate. Jameson's gaze flicked toward him, sharp and knowing. Isn't there? Jonathan hesitated, his expression tightening. Jameson let the silence stretch. He wanted them to think about it. Wanted them to recognize the real problem. If Nora won her claim to the estate, she would own the house. That was bad enough. But it wasn't the worst part. If she won, it meant Vincent's will was legitimate all along. And if that was legitimate, then the rest of his estate, the parts that had been swallowed up into the Hayes family fortune, the stocks, the land holdings, the trust funds, could also be contested. Jonathan's expression shifted, as if the realization had finally hit him. If she's recognized as an heir, he trailed off. Jameson didn't say anything. He just let the words settle. Eleanor was the first to break the silence. Then we have a problem. Jonathan looked at Jameson, for once not with condescension, but with something closer to unease. We could lose everything. Jameson's jaw tensed. He had spent years securing his position, his reputation, his empire. He had built wealth upon wealth, carefully crafting the kind of success that people envied. And now it was all at risk. Eleanor reached for her drink and took a slow sip. Then we settle. Jonathan turned to her. What? We give her what she's asking for, she said simply. The house. Jonathan's nostrils flared. You want to just hand it over? Eleanor tilted her head. Would you rather give her the entire fortune? Jonathan didn't answer. Jameson stared at the fire crackling in the grand fireplace, his expression unreadable. Eleanor set down her drink. We offer a settlement. She gets the estate. And in return, she signs away any claim to the rest of it. Jonathan let out a slow breath, then turned to Jameson. And you're fine with that? Jameson's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. No, he wasn't fine with it. But he was smart enough to know when he was cornered. Nora Dawson had been nothing more than a minor annoyance when she first showed up. He had dismissed her, mocked her, threatened her. And yet, she was still here. Still fighting. Still winning. Jameson exhaled through his nose and stood. Make the offer. Jonathan hesitated. Are you sure? Jameson didn't look at him. He just adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. We need to put this behind us, he said simply. Eleanor watched him go, then turned to Jonathan. Call the lawyers. The settlement offer arrived the next morning, neatly typed and bound in a leather folder, as if the weight of its contents could be softened by expensive presentation. Nora sat across from Alan Whitmore in his office, staring at the papers with a mix of triumph and something she couldn't quite name. They're giving you the house, Alan said, flipping through the documents. No fight. No further disputes. Full transfer of ownership. Nora's hands tightened in her lap. And? Alan gave her a knowing look. And they want you to sign a waiver stating you'll never make another claim against the Hayes family fortune. She exhaled slowly. They were scared. Not just of losing the house. Of losing everything. She had backed them into a corner, and this was their attempt at an escape hatch. Alan placed a pen on the folder, watching her carefully. It's a good deal, Nora. She didn't move. It was a good deal. More than she had ever imagined when she started this fight. But as she sat there, staring at the papers, something inside her wouldn't let her pick up that pen just yet. The house had been Vincent's way of making things right. His way of giving her mother something after his son refused to. But it had been stripped from them. And then Vincent himself had been stripped of his legacy, his name tarnished by the family that had inherited his fortune. That couldn't stand. I want them to revoke the insanity ruling, she said, voice steady. Alan blinked. You. I want them to acknowledge that Vincent was not mentally incompetent when he wrote his will, she continued. That his wishes were valid, and that they erased them for their own gain. Alan sat back, tilting his head slightly. That's a much bigger ask. I don't care. He studied her, then nodded. I'll add it to the conditions. Nora exhaled. But she wasn't done. She tapped her fingers against her knee, thinking. I also want a trust fund for Maddie. Alan frowned. You want financial support from the family? No, she said sharply. I want it in Vincent's name. A trust set aside for his great-granddaughter, not because I want her to have money, but because I want her to know that good people existed in her lineage. That someone, somewhere in that family, cared about doing the right thing. Alan considered that for a long moment. Then he smiled. You're making them eat their own words, you know. She lifted a brow. They spent all this time trying to erase you, he said, amused. Now they'll have to sign paperwork ensuring that Vincent's name is permanently tied to you and Maddie. Nora shrugged. Poetic, isn't it? Alan chuckled, then pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Let's give them something to think about. The Hayes family did not like the new terms. Jonathan nearly had a stroke when he saw the revision. Absolutely not, he spat, throwing the papers onto the table in the study. The house was already too much, now she wants to rewrite history. Jameson, for once, said nothing. Eleanor calmly lifted the papers and read them over, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against the leather binding. She's not rewriting history, she murmured. She's correcting it. Jonathan glared at her. We declared my father incompetent for a reason. Eleanor looked at him over the rim of her glasses. Yes. And we lied. Silence stretched between them. She set the papers down. We're signing it. Jonathan's face twisted. Eleanor. This is over, she interrupted, her voice firm. Let the girl have what's rightfully hers. Let Vincent's name be restored. Jameson exhaled through his nose, finally speaking. We'll keep the estate. We'll keep the fortune. She gets the house and a symbolic trust fund. We don't let this drag out in court. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. I won't be a part of this. Eleanor picked up the pen. Then don't. And just like that, it was done. Nora stood in the vast, empty foyer of her house, the weight of it all sinking in as she looked around. It had been cleaned out. No traces of the family remained, no staged furniture, no heirlooms, no ghosts of people who had never wanted her there. It was hers. But she didn't want it. Not really. She walked through the halls, running her fingers along the ornate wood banisters, the stone fireplace, the enormous windows that overlooked the sprawling green of the estate. She could sell it. Make a fortune. Start fresh somewhere new. But she already knew what she was going to do. She pulled out the letter she had written and set it carefully on the grand entry table. It was addressed to a women's shelter organization, one that helped single mothers find stability, find safety, find a way to never have to sleep in their cars with their children again. She had the deed now. The property was hers. And soon, it would belong to someone who truly needed it. She never wanted another woman to feel the way her mother had. She turned, walking out of the house without looking back. Texas was warmer than she expected. Maddie was asleep in the passenger seat, her curls stuck to her cheek, her little face soft with dreams. Nora glanced in the rearview mirror at the open land stretching beyond the horizon, the fields golden under the setting sun. Her mother had always talked about moving back. Going home. Now, Nora was finally doing it for her. The small ranch she had purchased was just outside of town, with a wraparound porch and acres of possibility. It was nothing like the mansion she had left behind, and that was exactly why she loved it. She pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine and taking a deep breath. This was hers. Not because it had been handed down. Not because it was part of some twisted inheritance battle. Because she had chosen it. She reached over, brushing Maddie's hair back gently. We're home, she whispered. Maddie stirred, rubbing her eyes. Home? Nora smiled. Yes, baby, she said softly. We're finally home.